Welcome to another episode of GitHub Copilot. Documentation have an important role in the development cycle. A properly documented code will be treated as good quality. It impacts various NFRs in terms of readability. The code will be more understandable, maintainability. In a longer run, someone else may be going to modify your code and extend it further, so extensibility of the code. So many aspects depends on the properly documented code. So let us see how GitHub Copilot can help you in a documentation process. Saying that there are multiple ways of documentation. It can be the line by line commenting of the code, explaining what exactly each line of code or block of code is doing, or the documentation on top of the public methods, which helps the external callers or the methods which consume this public method to understand what exactly the functionality of that public method. Instead of going in details, a simple documentation on top of the public method will give a lot of information. In another case, we do documentation of APIs based on various external systems like a Swagger documentation, or we try to extract information from the code to understand what exactly the code is used or what resources are dependent on the code. So various kind of documentation requirements are there in the coding cycle. So let us see how Copilot can help in documentation. I'm in VS Code. The simple policies file is here. So start with the first one. We need the documentation of this public method. I can ask Copilot chat to add documentation to my code. This will ensure that a proper documentation is added to my code. Most of the time, as a developer, it's very difficult for us to explain each and every aspects of the code. So the companionship of Copilot will reduce our overhead in documenting everything. Instead of that, Copilot will help us to document the code properly. Here you can observe that it's added the top level documentation. It can be the Java doc or the documentation related to your technology. Here in .NET, we are using a summary and param clause. Similarly, in Java, we use different constructs for documentation. Copilot is able to understand what technology your code is. Based on that, it adds the documentation on top of the public method. And also it's add the documentation inside the code block. You can see there is a documentation coming inside. Sometimes when you say add documentation, it treat it as a method level documentation or treat it as the documentation requirements on top of the public methods. In that case, it may not add the documentation internally. If you encounter such situation, you can prompt Copilot to say add documentation and code comments. Code comments is the way we do the commenting of lines of code. So you can combine these two words, the documentation and code comments, to get an internal documentation or internal comments in the code blocks. Here you can see that the Copilot extended the feature. It's added a public method level documentation, and also it's added the comments for each block of code in a detailed manner. And the comments are very self-explanatory, or it's aligned to what exactly each of these lines are doing. So if you compare the previous one and this one, in the previous case, you have the comments in a block of code. Here you have a comment, but still there is no specific comments for this lines of code. When you say code comments, it comes to each line and try to give some comments. So you can see exactly what exactly each of the lines of code. This kind of documentation or code comment will be helpful for dealing with complex implementation, where you may need the explanation line by line, explaining what exactly each line is doing. Most of the time, in a simple code like this one, you can ignore this one and go for a block-based documentation that is supported in the previous response. Here it's giving a block-based documentation that is enough for this simple method, but if it is a complex one, go for a code comment, and once it's done, you can verify it and then replace your code with the documented code. So it's a fully documented code is available here. You can go ahead and use this one. So this is the first aspect of documentation, where we will be using the document and comment. These are the two constructs for documenting your code. Now coming to the API documentation. Once you are in an API, here we are using a ASP.NET API. So it can be your Java Spring Boot API or a API aligned to any of the technologies, Node.js or anything. So when it comes to an API documentation, mainly we depends on a proper documentation based on an external system like a Swagger documentation. So here we have an API defined in Clinic Appointment Controller. There are multiple APIs without any documentation captured here. So I need a detailed documentation that is an external documentation, not part of the code base. If you want the documentation in the code base, use the exactly similar kind of prompt to get the documentation. But here I am looking at creation of external Swagger document which can explain these public APIs for the consumers. So it's an external documentation I am looking at. So how we can achieve that? So you can go ahead and ask Copilot, create an API documentation aligned to, I am referring Swagger here, Swagger documentation for the APIs defined in hash file. I am using a context variable here to pick my file, that is nothing but clinic appointment controller.cs. This is what I am passing right now. I need a Swagger kind of that pattern of documentation which I can use externally for this clinic appointment controller.cs file. So let us see how the documentation is coming up with. It's defined the structure and the title is My Health API because My Health is my application or namespace. On top of that, it start adding the detailed documentation. So if you observe here, it start with the first one, clinic appointment ID. Its summary is to get the clinic appointment, and there is one parameter called ID, that is a record field, an integer, and the response is successful operation, and the reference is this one. Similarly, it's added for each of the APIs in detailed explanation what exactly each of these APIs are doing, and came up with the structure which is aligned to a Swagger documentation. This I can export to Swagger or external systems for a proper API documentation external to the code base. And now if you look at the last portion, there is a reference to clinic appointment object which is defined in a separate file, and that file is not available right now, not open here. I didn't use any workspace also, so it's not, Copilot is not able to get that file. So that information is provided here. The clinic appointment model is not visible, that's why the details are end here where I need to add the details further. Same prompt, and I am adding use the file, nothing but clinic appointment.cs. So I am just passing this file now, and let us see whether Copilot is able to get the object details and fill the information here. So it's coming with the Swagger documentation, and at the end it should get the object details from clinic appointment as well. You can see that there is a clinic appointment object is taken, and the details in terms of that file, whichever file you have passed, that contain, there is an ID, date, description, patient ID, doctor ID, room number. These are the fields available in that file. So it's able to capture the file information as part of your API documentation. So any dependent object, most of the time your API will be dependent on some of the external objects. Pass that detail as part of your prompt so that you will get a complete documentation of your API in a proper way, which explain even the supporting objects as well. This object is very important because some of this API may be using that. For example, add sync. This public API need the clinic appointment as a input object. Unless we know the structure of this object, we may not able to give the proper information. So a detailed information on the structure of this clinic appointment should be there as part of our API documentation. So if you want to get that information, pass that file information. This is a normal API documentation, and sometimes we may not require this detailed API documentation. Instead of that, we may be looking at what exactly the functionality of this APIs in this particular class. Can Copilot help there? So let us ask that one. Create a functional documentation explaining the various public APIs in, again passing the file, that is a clinic appointment controller. This is the file I am using. Either you can use the hash editor to refer this one, the file opened. The next prompt we will look on that one. Refer this file using a hash editor. Next example, we'll see how to refer this file using a hash editor context variable. This functional documentation you can copy into your project documents and share with the stakeholders. It's given a detailed information in terms of what's exactly the different APIs, the parameters, what's a return type it's expecting. So each of the APIs URL and a description and parameter return type, that's a format adopted here. If you have a different format in mind, pass that as part of your prompt. So I am using exactly the same prompt. Instead of passing the file, you can pass editor. That indicate that whatever is opened in my code editor, use that and come up with the detailed documentation. So both are same. Either you pass a file which may or may not be open in your editor, or pass hash editor to refer the file open in your editor. Both refers to the same. In our case, we pass the same file together. So this another way of documentation, Saga documentation, and we went for a functional documentation. Sometimes we are dealing with a huge file. We need to understand what kind of data is there. One example is I have this ARM template, especially used for provisioning the resources in Azure as a cloud. So each of the cloud have their infrastructure as a code methodologies. Here I am using an ARM based approach for Azure provisioning. It can be a JSON file, it can be a Terraform script, anything. So it's a lengthy file available here. I just want to get an understanding on what are the resources I am going to provision. There are multiple resource provisioning happening. Am I getting the complete details in a very script manner or summary manner from the Copilot? So let us see how Copilot is able to get it. So prepare a documentation by listing the cloud resources mentioned in hash file. I'm going to pass the template file here. So from this template, extract all the cloud resources details, which helps me to go and have a look on what kind of resources I'm going to provision using ARM. Whether any resource missing, then I can go ahead and add that particular resource. There is the SQL Server, that's the first one. So looks like here the first resource is a SQL Server. Let us double verify whether it captures everything. Second one is firewall rules. So looks like this may be the firewall rules resource. The second one, it's related to SQL Server again. This one is captured. The next is SQL Server and we have insights. So there is an insights component. That's the next one. And we have server form. So these all are insight components. And we have server forms here. So we have a server forms, and under insight we have a auto scale setting. So that also coming here, auto scale settings, and end with websites. So that's the last one. So instead of going through this 400 lines of code line by line and understanding what resources, what will be the usage of that resources and everything, you can simply ask Copilot to extract the information from a complex file and represent in a proper way. This will help us to understand the file better or extract some insightful which will help us to extend or fix some bugs related to this file. We have explored different kind of documentation, starting with the code level documentation and code comments and creation of a Saga document, even passing as dependent object, and we can get the help of Copilot for functional documentation and end with extraction of data from the code in a proper documentation way. Thank you.